Splintered timber from the Conestoga wagon bore a grim, violent stain, painting a picture of survival against impossible odds. Out here in the unforgiving Wyoming territory, a brutal ambush should have been her absolute end. Instead, it was the violent beginning of a romance that defied every law of the untamed West. Dust choked the stifling August air, clinging to the sweat on Eleanor Montgomery's brow as the heavy wooden wheels of her family's wagon groaned against the unforgiving terrain of the Wyoming territory. It was 1867, a year when the West was fiercely divided between those looking to build a future and those desperate to steal one. Eleanor sat beside her older brother, Thomas, her hands gripping the wooden bench until her knuckles turned a stark, bone white. They had separated from a larger wagon train near Fort Laramie, a decision Thomas had insisted upon. He carried something far more valuable than the flour barrels and cast-iron stoves that weighed down their suspension. A leather-bound ledger detailing the fraudulent land acquisitions of the Union Pacific Railroad, evidence he intended to deliver to a federal circuit judge in Cheyenne. Silence had fallen over the canyon known locally as Dead Man's Crossing, a narrow, jagged scar in the earth flanked by towering limestone cliffs. The unnatural quiet was the first warning. Not a single cicada hummed. Not a single hawk cried out. Gunfire shattered the afternoon. The first shot took the lead draft horse down in a terrifying tangle of leather harnesses and frantic, screaming horseflesh. The wagon violently lurched forward, pitching Eleanor against the wooden siding. Before she could even draw a breath to scream, a second volley of rifle fire rained down from the ridge. Thomas shoved her down into the footwell, his hands trembling as he reached for the Henry repeating rifle stowed beneath the buckboard. "Keep your head down, Abby. Don't you dare look up," Thomas bellowed, his voice cracking under the deafening echo of lead striking the iron rims of their wheels. 6 riders descended from the scrub brush and pinyon pines like wolves upon a wounded calf. They were rough, sun-baked men wearing faded dusters, their faces obscured by filthy bandanas. Eleanor could only see the tops of their boots and the dust kicked up by their horses' hooves through the slats of the wagon bed. Thomas fired twice, the sharp crack of his rifle returning fire, followed by a sickening thud and a heavy groan. "Get the Montgomery boy, but leave the wagon intact until we find the book," a gravelly voice ordered. It was a voice Eleanor would later learn belonged to Jeremiah Cobb, a ruthless former bushwhacker who had once ridden with the notorious Reynolds gang. Suddenly, the wagon lurched violently sideways. One of the surviving horses, maddened by the scent of blood and the deafening noise, bucked wildly in its traces. The heavy wooden wheels slid dangerously close to the crumbling edge of the ravine. Eleanor felt the stomach-dropping sensation of weightlessness as the earth gave way beneath them. The wagon tipped, rolling over the precipice. Wood splintered with the sound of snapping bones. Crates of iron tools, sacks of beans, and heavy trunks became lethal projectiles within the canvas cover. Eleanor was thrown violently against the roof boughs, her vision exploding into a constellation of bright, blinding stars before everything went mercifully black. When consciousness slowly trickled back, it brought an agonizing symphony of pain. Her left leg was pinned beneath a heavy oak crossbeam, and her right shoulder throbbed with a fiery intensity. The wagon was completely destroyed, reduced to a jagged pile of canvas and lumber at the bottom of the ravine. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. Above her, at the rim of the canyon, she could hear the muffled voices of the outlaws. "Check the wreckage. Find the ledger. Then put a bullet in anyone still breathing." Cobb's voice floated down, cold and detached. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears cutting tracks through the thick dust on her face. She tried to shift the beam, but it was useless. She was trapped, completely exposed beneath the ripped canvas, waiting for the inevitable execution. The crunch of boots on loose gravel told her the men were sliding down the embankment. She held her breath, praying for a swift end. Then, the canyon fell deathly silent again. The approaching footsteps stopped. A sharp, wet thud echoed through the ravine, followed by a gurgling choke. A second man yelled out in panic, but his cry was instantly cut short by the heavy, echoing boom of a Sharps buffalo rifle. Chaos erupted on the embankment. The outlaws were screaming, returning fire blindly into the dense tree line. "Where is he? I can't see him," one of the ambushers shrieked, sheer panic replacing his previous bravado. Through a tear in the canvas, Eleanor forced her heavy eyelids open. A shadow detached itself from the ancient pines. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, a massive man clad in worn buckskin and a heavy bear fur coat, despite the summer heat. A thick, dark beard obscured his face, but his eyes, a piercing, icy gray, locked onto the outlaws with lethal intent. He didn't waste movements. He carried a heavy, serrated hunting knife in one hand and his rifle in the other. In a matter of seconds, the 3 men who had ventured down the ravine were dead. The remaining riders at the top of the ridge, panicked by the sudden brutal slaughter of their comrades, spurred their horses and fled back toward the canyon mouth, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. The mountain man stood perfectly still, listening to the fading hoofbeats. Once he was certain the area was clear, he turned his attention to the ruined wagon. He approached with heavy, deliberate steps. Eleanor's heart hammered against her bruised ribs like a trapped bird. She had heard horrifying tales of the mountain men who lived feral in the Rockies, men who had forgotten their humanity decades ago. He crouched beside the wreckage, his massive hands gripping the oak crossbeam that trapped her leg. Without a word, he strained, the muscles in his arms bulging beneath his buckskin shirt as he lifted the heavy timber just enough for Eleanor to drag her leg free. She gasped, a ragged sob tearing from her throat as she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the splintered floorboards. "Easy," the man said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, surprisingly gentle for a man of his imposing stature. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached out, his calloused, blood-stained hands gently checking her shoulder. "Collarbone is intact. Ribs are bruised, maybe cracked. Can you stand?" My brother," Eleanor stammered, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Thomas." The mountain man's gaze shifted toward the top of the ridge, his expression hardening. He had seen the body up there. He didn't need to speak the words. Eleanor read the tragic truth in his icy gray eyes. A wail of pure agony escaped her, and she lunged forward, trying to climb the embankment, but her injured leg buckled instantly. He caught her before she hit the ground, sweeping her into his massive arms as effortlessly as if she were a child. "We can't stay here," he murmured, his voice rumbling against her ear. "Cobb will realize he was spooked by one man and he'll bring the rest of his dogs back. We're going up the mountain." "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her vision swimming as the pain and shock finally overwhelmed her system. "Name's Gideon," he replied, turning toward the dense, impenetrable forest of the Bitterroot Range. "And you, Miss Montgomery, are a long way from home." The journey up the mountain was a fever dream of agonizing pain, swaying motion, and the overwhelming scent of pine needles and damp earth. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of being secured to a broad-shouldered saddle. Her body pressed against Gideon's solid chest to keep her from falling. He rode a massive black draft cross, a beast seemingly bred for the steep, treacherous inclines of the Rockies. They rode for hours, climbing higher into the jagged peaks where the air grew thin and bitingly cold. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes with any sense of clarity, she found herself staring up at a ceiling of hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and dried moss. A warm fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth to her right, casting dancing orange shadows across the small, meticulously clean cabin. The sharp, medicinal scent of yarrow and boiled willow bark hung heavy in the air. She was lying in a narrow bed covered in thick, surprisingly soft wolf pelts. Her heavy, dust-caked riding dress had been removed, replaced by an oversized, rough-spun cotton shirt. Panic seized her for a fleeting second before she realized her wounds had been expertly bandaged. A tight binding of clean linen wrapped around her cracked ribs, and a poultice of crushed green leaves had been applied to a deep laceration on her thigh. "Drink this. It will help the pain." She startled, turning her head to see Gideon sitting by the hearth. In the firelight, he looked less like a feral beast and more like a weary soldier. His dark hair was tied back with a strip of leather, and the thick beard framed a face marked by harsh weather and old, faded scars. He held a tin cup out to her, the steam rising in swirling tendrils. Eleanor pushed herself up onto her good elbow, wincing as a sharp spike of pain shot through her side. She took the cup with trembling hands, blowing on the bitter-smelling liquid before taking a sip. It tasted of dirt and mint, but it cast a sudden, warm numbness down her throat. "You took off my dress," she stated, her voice raspy, trying to maintain a shred of Eastern dignity despite her utter helplessness. "It was soaked in blood and dirt," Gideon replied, his tone perfectly flat, devoid of any inappropriate inflection. "Infections kill faster than bullets up here. Your brother's ledger was in the inner pocket. I set it on the table." Eleanor's eyes darted to a small, hand-carved pine table near the window. The leather-bound book sat there, completely intact. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a crushing wave of grief. Thomas was gone. The weight of his death pressed down on her chest, heavier than the oak beam that had pinned her in the wagon. Tears spilled over her cheeks, silent and hot. Gideon didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be all right, because they both knew it wasn't. Instead, he pulled a wooden stool closer to the bed and sat, resting his forearms on his knees. "Jeremiah Cobb doesn't leave loose ends," Gideon said softly, giving her a moment to process her grief before bringing her back to the harsh reality of their situation. He was hired by the Union Pacific to ensure that book never reached the judge in Cheyenne. "He's got 24 men combing the foothills for you right now." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her oversized sleeve. "How do you know who he is? How do you know what the book is?" Gideon stared into the fire, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the pop and hiss of burning sap. "Because in 1863, Cobb was my commanding officer in the Missouri Partisan Rangers," Gideon finally answered, his voice dropping an octave. "We burned farms. We tore up tracks. We did terrible things in the name of a war I eventually realized was built on rich men's greed. When the war ended, Cobb took his men west and turned to contract killing. I walked away, came up here to forget the smell of gunpowder and burning timber." He turned his piercing gray eyes back to her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a flash of profound vulnerability beneath his hardened exterior. "I heard the gunfire this afternoon," he continued. "Recognized the sound of Cobb's favored repeating rifles. By the time I reached the ridge, your brother was gone. I'm sorry I wasn't faster, Eleanor." Hearing her first name spoken in his deep, gravelly voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. She studied him. The calloused hands that had snapped a man's neck hours ago were the same hands that had carefully cleaned her wounds and brewed her tea. He was a man composed entirely of contradictions, a lethal weapon sheathed in quiet solitude. "You saved my life," she said, her voice steadying. "You didn't have to step out of the trees, Gideon. You could have stayed hidden." "I stopped hiding a long time ago," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before he stood up abruptly, as if entirely uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy blooming in the small cabin. He moved to the window, pushing back a heavy canvas curtain to peer out into the pitch-black mountain night. "You need to rest," he instructed, his tone shifting back to the gruff, commanding mountain man. "The willow bark tea will put you to sleep soon. Tomorrow, we need to talk about how I'm going to get you to Cheyenne alive." "You're coming with me?" Eleanor asked, a strange sense of relief anchoring her fluttering heart. "I made an oath never to point a rifle at another man again when I built this cabin," Gideon said, his broad back turned to her. He reached up, taking his Winchester from the pegs above the door and checking the action with a fluid, practiced motion. "But Cobb brought my past to my front door. He murdered an innocent man for a railroad company's bloody ledger." He turned back to face her, his eyes cold and resolved. "I'm going to escort you to Cheyenne, Miss Montgomery, and then I am going to hunt Jeremiah Cobb down and send him to hell." Eleanor sank back into the wolf pelts, the potent tea finally dragging her exhausted mind towards sleep. As her eyes fluttered shut, she watched Gideon pull a chair to the door, sitting down with his rifle resting across his lap, an immovable sentinel in the dark. For the first time since the ambush, she felt safe. But that fragile peace was shattered just hours later. In the dead of night, Eleanor was jolted awake by a sound that froze the blood in her veins. Echoing up through the jagged canyons, carried on the bitter mountain wind, came the distinct, rhythmic baying of bloodhounds. Cobb's men had found their trail. "Can you ride?" Gideon demanded, his voice a harsh whisper as he materialized beside her bed. He didn't wait for an answer, thrusting a thick wool coat into her arms. "Put this on. Button it to the chin. The wind on the ridge will cut right through you." Eleanor gritted her teeth, ignoring the white-hot flare of agony in her ribs as she swung her injured leg over the side of the bed. "I can ride. What about your cabin?" "Wood and mud," he grunted, shoving a handful of brass cartridges into his coat pockets. He grabbed the leather-bound ledger, shoving it securely into his saddlebag. "I can rebuild a cabin. I can't rebuild you. Let's move." He led her out the back door into the biting cold of the Wyoming night. His massive black draft horse, Samson, was already saddled and waiting in the shadows of the pines. Gideon lifted her effortlessly into the saddle, then stepped back inside the cabin for a brief, frantic minute. When he emerged, the sharp, pungent scent of black powder clung to his buckskin jacket. He swung up behind her, wrapping his thick, muscular arms around her waist to grab the reins. His broad chest pressed against her back, radiating a fierce, solid heat that anchored her against the terror tearing at her mind. "Hold tight, Eleanor," he murmured, his breath hot against her freezing ear. "Samson knows the way." They surged forward into the pitch-black forest, just as the first flicker of torches appeared on the switchback trail leading to the clearing. Gideon spurred the horse up a nearly vertical goat path, navigating blindly through the dense timber. They hadn't gone 300 yards when a colossal roar shattered the night. Eleanor twisted in the saddle just in time to see the cabin erupt into a blinding ball of orange and yellow fire. Flaming logs shot into the sky like matchsticks. Cobb's men screamed over the roar of the explosion, the black powder trap Gideon had rigged, turning his sanctuary into a deadly inferno for the first men through the door. "That will buy us a few hours," Gideon rumbled, steering Samson higher into the jagged peaks. "The dogs will lose our scent in the smoke and the shale." For 2 grueling days, they rode across a treacherous, razor-thin ridge known by trappers as the Devil's Spine. The wind howled relentlessly, but Gideon's arms never faltered, holding Eleanor securely against him. The shared hardship stripped away the formalities of their disparate worlds. In the freezing, silent hours of the night, huddled together beneath heavy furs for survival, they shared pieces of their souls. Eleanor spoke of Thomas, of her family's bankrupt farm back in Ohio, and of the desperate gamble to expose the Union Pacific's corrupt land grabs spearheaded by Thomas Durant's ruthless syndicates. Gideon listened, his rough thumb absent-mindedly tracing circles on her shoulder. In turn, he confessed the nightmares of the war that still plagued him, the blood on his hands, the senseless destruction he had wrought under Cobb's command, and his deep, paralyzing fear that the wilderness had stripped him of his humanity. "You aren't a monster, Gideon," Eleanor whispered one night, her fingers tentatively reaching up to brush a strand of dark hair from his scarred forehead. "You are the only decent thing I have found in this entire territory." His gray eyes darkened in the moonlight. Before he could stop himself, he leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. It was a desperate, hesitant kiss, tasting of wood smoke, coffee, and raw, undeniable longing. For a fleeting second, the danger surrounding them vanished, replaced by the thrumming beat of 2 hearts recognizing each other in the dark. But survival left little room for romance. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they began their descent toward the rolling plains outside Cheyenne, their luck finally shattered. A loud crack echoed through the spruce trees, and Samson reared up with a terrifying whinny. Eleanor screamed as a bullet tore through the cantle of the saddle, inches from her hip. Gideon reacted instinctively, twisting his body to shield hers as 3 men on horseback burst from the brush. "Get down!" Gideon roared, shoving her out of the saddle into a patch of tall golden needlegrass. Another volley of gunfire erupted. Gideon returned fire with his Winchester, the lever action working furiously. He dropped the first rider with a clean shot to the chest, but the second man fired a lucky shot from his Colt revolver. The heavy lead ball caught Gideon high in the right shoulder, spinning him violently backward. "Gideon!" Eleanor screamed. He hit the dirt hard, his rifle skittering out of reach. The third rider, a vicious-looking man with a badly scarred cheek, spurred his horse forward, drawing a long cavalry saber to finish the downed mountain man. Adrenaline overrode Eleanor's pain. She scrambled through the dirt, her fingers closing around the cold steel of Thomas's Henry repeating rifle, which had fallen from the scabbard. She hoisted the heavy barrel, resting it over a rotting log, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil bruised her already battered shoulder, but the shot was true. The rider tumbled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The final man, seeing his companions slaughtered by a woman and a wounded mountain man, turned tail and galloped frantically toward the plains. Eleanor dropped the rifle, crawling frantically to Gideon. Blood was soaking through his buckskin jacket, bright and terrifying. "I've got you," she choked out, pressing her hands frantically over the wound. "I've got you, Gideon. Don't you dare die on me after everything." He offered a strained, bloody smile, his large hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Takes more than a stray bullet to kill a bear, Eleanor." Cheyenne was a chaotic, sprawling boomtown built on mud, canvas, and railroad money. Steam engines hissed and roared in the rail yards, mingling with the shouts of gamblers, cattle drovers, and prostitutes. It took them 2 more agonizing days to reach the city limits. Eleanor had managed to staunch Gideon's bleeding, binding his shoulder tightly with torn strips of her petticoat, but fever burned brightly in his veins. They tied Samson in an alleyway behind the assayer's office, relying on the crowded, muddy streets to mask their arrival. Gideon leaned heavily against Eleanor, his face pale, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill in the air. "Judge Harrison Davies," Gideon gritted out, checking the cylinder of his Colt revolver with his good hand. "His office is in the brick building across the thoroughfare. We walk straight in, we hand him the ledger, and we get the hell out." Eleanor clutched the leather-bound book to her chest like a shield. They stepped out into the chaotic street, dodging freight wagons and drunken cowboys. The federal building loomed ahead, a symbol of order in a lawless land. They reached the wooden boardwalk in front of the double doors. Freedom, justice, and safety were merely 10 steps away. "Going somewhere, Gideon?" The voice was like dragging a rusted blade across stone. Eleanor froze. Emerging from the shadows of the courthouse pillars was Jeremiah Cobb. He looked older than Gideon had described, his hair graying beneath a black bowler hat, but his eyes were flat, dead, and terrifyingly cold. He held a customized Schofield revolver, the barrel aimed squarely at Eleanor's heart. 2 heavily armed thugs stepped out from the alleyway behind them, cutting off any avenue of escape. "I heard my men caught up to you on the ridge," Cobb sneered, stepping into the muddy street. "Heard a little Eastern girl managed to shoot one of my best trackers. Hand over the book, Miss Montgomery. The Union Pacific is willing to pay handsomely for its return, and I'm willing to let you walk away. But the traitor dies." He pointed the gun at Gideon. "She's not giving you anything, Cobb," Gideon growled, pushing Eleanor slightly behind him, despite his shattered shoulder. "You always were stubborn, Gideon. Cost you everything during the war. Now it's going to cost you your life," Cobb said, pulling the hammer back on his revolver. Time seemed to slow to a terrifying crawl. Gideon didn't try to draw his gun. With his right arm useless, he knew he wasn't fast enough. Instead, he did what he had always done. He used his sheer, overwhelming size. With a feral roar, Gideon lunged forward, charging straight into the barrel of Cobb's gun. Cobb fired. The bullet grazed Gideon's ribs, tearing through leather and flesh, but the mountain man's momentum didn't stop. He slammed into Cobb like a runaway freight train, tackling the outlaw into the thick, churning mud of the street. The 2 thugs raised their rifles, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. She whipped Thomas's Henry rifle to her shoulder and fired blindly at the men, forcing them to dive behind a horse trough for cover. The street erupted into chaos. Civilians screamed and scattered, diving into saloons and general stores. In the mud, it was a brutal, primeval struggle. Cobb was fighting for his paycheck. Gideon was fighting for the woman he loved. Despite his injuries, Gideon managed to pin Cobb's gun arm down with his knee. With a final, agonizing surge of strength, Gideon drove his massive left fist into Cobb's jaw. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the screams of the crowd. Cobb went limp, unconscious in the muck. The federal doors suddenly burst open. Judge Harrison Davies, flanked by 4 armed U.S. Marshals, stepped out onto the boardwalk, their rifles raised. "Drop your weapons!" the lead marshal shouted. Eleanor instantly lowered the rifle, her hands trembling as she fell to her knees in the mud beside Gideon. She pulled the ledger from beneath her coat and held it up toward the judge. "My name is Eleanor Montgomery," she cried out, her voice echoing over the silent, stunned street. "My brother was murdered by these men on behalf of the railroad. This book holds the proof of their stolen land." Judge Davies, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, walked slowly down the steps. He looked at the unconscious Cobb, then at the bloodied mountain man, and finally at the ledger in Eleanor's shaking hands. He took the book gently. "I have been waiting for Thomas Montgomery for a week," Davies said softly. "You have done a brave thing, young lady. Marshals, secure these men. Fetch a doctor for this man immediately." Weeks later, the first snows began to blanket the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots. The Union Pacific scandal had rocked Washington, leading to the arrest of dozens of corrupt officials. Eleanor stood on the porch of a newly constructed log cabin, wrapping a thick wool